This conversation is part of the What's Next lecture series. So why are we not lecturing?
So we are lecturing, just not lecturing in person. So we've temporarily moved our office to the AA exhibition space for the duration of the exhibition and are currently working out of here.
All right, so we're stuck in here for the duration of the show, and the rules of the game are that we can't leave the space. So we had to do this video instead. We'll talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll open the doors between the rooms and invite the audience into the gallery so that you can see the work on display and ask any questions you might have. So what do we actually do in here on a daily basis?
Well, I guess that's the what's next part of the question. We do what we always do, so we try to explore new ideas about architecture and design from our position, which is at the intersection of material science and architecture. So what do you think we do?
I think, I'm not sure. I think what we do is that we're quite good at working with the fact that we're not sure. Of course, no one in architecture, certainly not after the First World War 100 years ago, knows exactly what they're doing, or at least they don't know what's next. That would contradict the entire process of architecture as an optimistic field of potential vectors in a search space of possibilities.
So you mean we analyze, we invent, we improvise, we experiment. We do all this work just to try and figure out what we might do with the materials that exist around us, as well as the ones that don't quite yet exist. So isn't it about us refusing to solve new challenges with ready-made solutions and being hell-bent on finding new ways of materializing our buildings into reality?
Well, we do that, but I think it's a bit bigger than that, actually. I think it's about this investigation that we keep coming back to, this theme about conflict and compromise in architecture.
Yeah, that's your favorite, for instance, but I kind of prefer to riff about architecture in the Materionic age.
I guess we're somewhere in between the two, but maybe we need to go back in time a little bit and backtrack if anyone is to understand who we are and what we are actually about.
Yeah, so we started studying together about 12-ish years ago in Oxford Brookes University.
Yeah, I walked up to you on the first day and said something like, "You're the youngest student here and I'm the oldest. We should work together."
Yeah, and then we did. So I'm not sure there's been a single architecture project of our own that we haven't done without collaborating ever since. So I remember once for a situationist project, we went up to London dressed as women to see how it might change our experience.
We did do that, but I thought we weren't going to mention it. Let's just say we worked together through the years at Brookes, where we were taught by David Green, who thought we should go to the AA. I remember you pushed me to send off my application to the AA, and then we both got in.
And then we both got out.
Well, though you got out a year before I did.
Yeah, let's not go there. And then we set up Ordinary in 2011. It's an architectural studio, but it's also a material laboratory where we test new ideas about what buildings might be made of in the future. So it's kind of half design laboratory, half design studio, half laboratory. A place filled with 3D printers, samples cut on our CNC machine, Bunsen burners, crystal experiments, evaporating in tanks, bacterial cultures, growing in dishes, and so on.
It's a truly experimental studio. We fail a lot, right? But one of the things about the AA was that people didn't seem to be very interested in materiality. My final thesis project in Dip 9 was for a 170-meter tall skyscraper made from bricks, load-bearing bricks. But at the time, very few people seemed interested in the potential of materiality. In Dip 5, we did these exquisite laser-cut card models, but it could really have been made from anything. The material is not important. So I think that the profession is great at producing eye-catching geometries, but some of the material sensibility has been lost in the process. And the other thing about the AA was that everything was called an experiment, but none of those experiments ever fail.
So I guess, in a way, Ordinary is a reaction to both of those things. So I did a project in Oliver's unit in my 5th year about using brass and essentially using brass to hide the seams between concrete panels. And I'm just kind of looking at this coffee cup here, and I've quickly enjoy it. But I've got a quote here next to me from David Chalner, which is quite interesting. It says a typical coffee business uses 0.2% of the coffee bean to produce a cup of coffee. So this actually means that about 99.8% of the coffee plant is waste. And then he goes on to say, what we don't understand, we can't possibly explain, value, or protect. And I think this points kind of towards the understanding that we're kind of aiming for.
Yeah, we know very little about the 5 nonillion, that's a 5 followed by 30 zeros, of bacteria around us, for instance. Together they form a biomass that is bigger than all the plants and animals combined. This bacterial biomass is so abundant that we don't know what to do with it.
And that kind of reminds me of a discussion we were having the other day about Buckminster Fuller's insight that we're passengers on a spaceship called Earth, and how we've moved beyond that to the equally obvious insight that we ourselves are spaceships for micro passengers that inhabit us. And I think there's about 500 species, if I'm right, that live in your gut alone.
That might be a good segue into the first project, actually, because while we both like Buckminster Fuller, we've also agreed that another of his quotes is a little bit outdated. You know, that old chestnut about how much a building weighs. We seem to be more interested in how the building uses its weight, how much energy it generates, and how much renewable tissue it embodies.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us to Beyond Endurance. It's one of the 9 timber skyscrapers we've designed over the past 2 years or so as part of the academic commission.
Can I just say before you go on that it's important to understand we're not thinking about it as paper architecture, though. We design these projects to get built, and we intend to prototype as much of it ourselves as possible, even when we know they probably won't get built and aren't necessarily meant to get built. And that's to do with this kind of formula that we work with. You need to add realism to expectation to get conceivable conjecture.
Yeah, and Beyond Endurance is a times energy skyscraper, so it doesn't just produce more energy than it consumes through adding a tiny bit of energy to a really tightly sealed shell, like a plus energy building. It's basically a power plant with living units attached to it. So it's our most advanced timber skyscraper so far, conceived partly as a thought experiment about the potential energy derived from the gravity drop of going to the bathroom on top of the shard. And it features this really interesting mix between composting towers that take care of all the energy, generated by the inhabitants, and these facade components that have solar panels and wind generating aerofluttering mechanisms and a water collection ability, all built into this one folded plywood panel.
Hinged through a rubber membrane laminated in between the sheets of plywood.
Yeah, and the living units that snake through it are mirrored. So there's an apartment on the bottom and a greenhouse on the top. So while it's not perhaps the most self-sufficient sort of construct, it does allow you to produce, with using the compost from the towers, a lot of the produce at home.
And the building is also controlled using evolutionary solvers, from the positioning of the towers on the site through to the best possible folding patterns for the components. Again, this is about celebrating the fact that we don't quite know all of the parameters until we've tested them, and about working with compromise. There are always multiple conflicting forces at play, and evolutionary logic helps us use that constructively rather than work against it.
And that's it's kind of what we're showing now in another timber skyscraper, and this one's called Against the Grain. So it's based on the reclamation of an abandoned gas holder that's just around the corner from our studio in Broadway Market.
All right, so that's the evolutionary solvers. Let's bring this back to the material of these buildings. Why is it important to make tall buildings out of wood?
Well, it's kind of, the construction industry is huge, and it's pretty good at polluting the planet. It's one of the largest users of energy, resources, water, and materials, in particular concrete. So timber is one of the most commonly grown and therefore exceptionally renewable. So it's this renewable building material, probably the most renewable building material on the planet today, and it stores carbon dioxide. So basically, the more timber buildings we can make, the better. We've said in the past that while we like the net zero movement rather than more passive houses, we think we need more active houses. So using responsibly sourced timber is one of the simple ways to activate a building in that respect.
I mean, material considerations are an obvious first step. The human evolution is often seen as a history of tool making, but we also move on as a species by conquering new materials. So we have the Stone Age giving way to the Copper Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and so on. Now we've conquered much more interesting and more advanced materials, and still the material palette that the building industry works with doesn't seem to change very often. It's a very slow process, right?
Yeah, well, like concrete is still very heavy, but it's clearly the most important building material on the planet, really.
It's almost the most important material in the world, full stop. It's the only thing we humans use more than water per person and per capita. Every year we consume more than 1.5 cubic meters of concrete for every single person on the planet. We're totally stuck in the concrete age. Aesthetically, I don't think either of us has a problem with that. I just think we can find smarter ways of making our buildings than to burn limestone and clay at 1450 degrees and produce a ton of carbon dioxide for every ton of cement that we make.
So we're going to make the world stop building with concrete and instead have them burn books into the building or make them out of pigment.
Yeah, now you're picking the two most fragile projects in the exhibition. I'd say those are still within the realm of conceivable conjectures, but it's this particular obsessiveness about the misuse of materials and the scaling of them in up or down in different directions into the realm of architecture that interests us. Our most exciting project that we're going to embark on perhaps in the exhibition is the piss house, where we will use human urine to develop a way of patinating public urinals.
So maybe we could move on to the exhibition a little bit then. Maybe we can use this exhibition to explain how we work and why we feel that slightly more conceptual discourse has its place even for a material practice such as ordinary.
Yeah, that's a great idea. The idea of the exhibition is that we've moved the desks and shelves and inspiration wall of material samples from our studio and into the gallery space. Here we should be very careful to mention that it's a wall that we have co-curated in proud collaboration with the Skin Gallery. So, what's your favorite material on the wall?
So it changes all the time, but at the moment, I'd have to say my favorite material is Caraflex, and this is quite a cool material. It's essentially a foldable, laser cuttable, flexible porcelain membrane, and essentially what you do is you fire it in a kiln, and then it solidifies into a hard porcelain. So if you kind of imagine every single architectural paper model on the planet as porcelain, it'd be pretty interesting.
Or if you consider every conceivable architecture paper model on the planet made from this. So this is my favorite at the moment. This is snail tile, which is made from snail poo. So this artist fed colored paper to snails, and they produced the raw material for this.
Oh yeah, now we've instantly gone a bit silly again, but the most important thing is that we have materials on the wall that correspond to the tables in the exhibition, which we kind of call our research departments.
Right, so each research department is thematically linked to a portion of the material inspiration wall, as well as to a particular material process or field. So we have the ceramics and glassmaking table, the woodworking table, the polymer science table, the metallurgy table, and behind the partition wall, the more scientific, future-looking stuff, synthetic chemistry and synthetic biology.
So I actually quite like some of the materials we worked on ourselves leading up to the exhibition, like the Nicky Crete, the wood foam panels, the Cassian panels, and the surfaces we made with magnetite and latex.
Yeah, the magnetic membranes were quite cool. I think they could work quite well as pavilion structures.
Yeah.
You fold them over and you use magnets to keep them in place. But we also had this kombucha thing that I quite like, this bacterial skin that we grew from a yeast culture, something that the designer Susan Lee has worked a lot with in the past, and now we're scaling this up to become an architectural project.
Yeah.
But if we're going to stick to the 25 minutes, we won't be able to talk about all these projects. So shall I do crystals or you do June?
Cool.
So I guess the first thing to say is that the material ages we talked about before come to an end. So we're no longer in the Stone Age or Iron Age. And when we break free from this concrete age, I think we find ourselves in an updated Timber Age. And I think then we'll enter the Meteorionic Age. So our experiments with crystals is a step towards that age.
Right. And in the Meteorionic Age, material systems are viewed holistically. It's an emergent field that examines fundamental links between material processes, structures, and properties from the nano to the macro scale, using systematic, experimental, theoretical, and computational methods.
Yeah, and our first project for the Meteorionic Age was called Crystallia, which is based on the idea of growing crystals into architecture. So we had to go into a laboratory to begin with to do it, though that's pretty okay with us that we'll basically do anything to get to wear a white lab coat.
Yeah, or at least to look very serious while stirring some shockingly blue liquid in a beaker as it heats up.
And we kind of think that forging these relationships with scientists seems to be the best way of moving architecture into the next material era. So for this project, we worked with a chemistry professor and grew crystals into architectural models. We then moved on to other crystals and made models of more crystalline buildings. So it's architecture through chemistry, so buildings that drip into shape over time, like stalactites and stalagmites. So a city that essentially begins to change through chemical reactions. So it's kind of like a city in constant flux.
Is there a construction idea that goes with it?
Well, there's a couple of different things you can perhaps do with it. So, like, it could be that Crystallia would cling to the cliff walls of a gorge, for instance. So we could control the water in an artificial dam, feed it with crystals that begin to grow into buildings. So maybe some of these crystal buildings could eventually melt back into the dam and recede and grow into new buildings. So at the moment, we're kind of focused on smaller details, like how to do a crystalline fenestration scheme, or how to filter light in strategic ways through different kinds of crystals to achieve certain architectural qualities and so on. So the truly interesting part is that link between the nano and the macro scale. So the extreme precision of chemistry, you consult the diagram and then watch as the crystallization kicks in exactly when the thermometer hits a certain temperature. It's quite wonderful to watch. And the day we convinced the client to actually build the crystal pavilion we've designed, I want to be in the room when the full-scale crystallization of the structure takes place.
You mentioned clients, and it might come as a surprise to some people that we're actually not afraid of them.
Yeah, we're definitely not afraid of clients, and while in the show we're showing kind of more speculative projects, we still love working with real-life clients. And for instance, this model here is a 25 square meter house. It's potentially one of the houses that we're doing that hopefully will get produced.
Yeah, this is a 25 square meter house, and it was designed specifically for the Swedish market, where in July this year it became legal to build a house at that size with a floor-to-ceiling height of 4 meters without any kind of building permission. Now there's a fairly big market for these houses, and we're in talks with the main developer about getting this one built, hopefully next year. So we are interested in moving some of the more conceptual ideas into potentially built projects, and we're also particularly interested in combining our ideas about evolutionary solvers with ideas of cost and practicalities of construction and kind of the everyday of getting buildings actually made.
So yeah, and we're also in talks with some people in Mauritania and China, where we're really hoping and looking to get this bacterial sandstone pavilions built.
Right, we are talking to a client who owns a desert in China about the possibility of building this pavilion out of sand that has been solidified by bacteria. And we're also talking to another client who owns a desert in Mauritania about building this one.
Yeah, and that's an extension of the original June project that was about a building 6,000 kilometers long, 6,000 kilometer long inhabitable wall across an entire African continent as a way of kind of coming to terms with the shifting sands and the issues of desertification.
Exactly, a city made from biologically solidified sand, a new way of constructing a very long and very narrow Pan-African city. So the project started with the realization that dry areas cover more than 1/3 of the Earth's land surface, and that some of those are already deserts and others are being seriously degraded by the shifting sands. So we wanted to view that fact optimistically, that the sand dunes, if you like, are almost like ready-made buildings. We just solidify the sand wherever we need solid surfaces and excavate the sand that we don't need, or maybe we can even have the wind excavate it for us. So the wind carries the sand onto the site and then carries the redundant sand away from the structure. The question then becomes one of how to solidify a sand dune. How do you glue those grains of sand together? And it turns out that at least one of those 5 nonylon bacteria that we mentioned before is particularly good at that. Bacillus pastori is readily available in marshes and wetlands, and they have this amazing ability to solidify loose sand into sandstone. You simply pour the bacteria onto sand, after which they enter the gaps between the grains. And then a chemical process produces calcite, which is a kind of natural cement, if you like. And that binds the grains together. It takes about 24 hours for this cementation process to take place, but then you need to flush through the liquid several times for it to reach optimal strength. So it's been shown in lab tests that after 6 or 7 flushes, it has reached optimum strength. So in theory, then, it would take about a week to turn a dune into a structurally sound sandstone building.
And we did a version at the urban scale as well.
Exactly, but I think the pavilion that we're making a model of in the gallery at the moment might get built first.
Yeah, so to most people, a city made from sand by bacterial construction, sand by bacterial construction workers, I guess, sounds pretty impossible, but why do we keep designing them?
I think, at least in part, because we think they will be very possible very soon. The other part, we feel it's highly important to continue to challenge our own and previous work. As technologies develop, so are the growing, the construction, and the manufacturing methods. I think when you start looking into these things and where we might be going, you find different people that are doing incredibly interesting work. And here's one of the scientists that I think might make this happen. Chris Voigt, one of our science heroes. He's a synthetic biology professor at the MIT. He's a kind of hacker, but he doesn't hack computers, he hacks bacteria. And he reprograms them to perform complex tasks.
Yeah, and he program bacteria to create this shape. So he gives them new senses like smell or the ability to perceive light. And then he kind of uses that to create binary circuit and make them choose between 2 options. So it's basically the beginning of a sort of biological computer.
Exactly, or a biological building. I mean, now consider a 3D version of that 2D experiment. So we have a 3D model that we make on the computer, and then the bacteria run out and form the shape or a layer of that shape within an aggregate, and then we solidify that the same way that we solidify the sand dune.
Yeah, like little biological robots inside the soil or the sand that help solidify it.
Yeah, a programmed material.
Yeah.
That would be architecture in the materiomic age. And I think that's why we're so fascinated with and excited by the possibilities of architecture in the materiomic age and where we're heading with the intersection between architecture and material science.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with that, we should probably say thank you very much for listening, and I think it's about time that we open the doors to the exhibition.
Thank you very much. Let's go and do that.